It started out as an ordinary day, but suddenly, in the midst of our peaceful morning, something terrible happened. The Nile, source of our life, was transformed. It turned blood red, became undrinkable. Its waters, clotted with dead fish, stank to high heavens. We found ways to cope. We dug around and located other water sources. 7 days passed, and life seemed to be returning to normal. But then came the frogs, teeming masses of them, hopping out of the river, invading our homes, crawling into our cooking pots. Things became increasingly bizarre after that, and day by day, our lives got more difficult. Egypt became unlivable, and we had no idea what was going on. We heard rumors that Pharaoh was being harangued by an elderly shepherd, something to do with slaves. But for us, the ordinary people of Egypt, it was simply a nightmare. And day after day, we wondered, why did our gods not protect us? It's interesting to think about how the plagues of Mitzrayim might have been experienced by the average Egyptian as a time of confusion, privation, and utter terror. For readers of the Torah, of course, the picture is very different. God is launching an all-out war on Pharaoh, blighting the land, systematically dismantling the foundations of Egyptian life, attacking the water system, tormenting and sickening the workers, killing the crops and the animals. With each blow, Pharaoh's power is weakened, and we watch him, blind, stubborn, selfish, and cruel, destroying himself and his people. We call God's actions against Pharaoh negaim, which means afflictions or plagues. But the Torah also uses another word to describe them, shifatim, which means both judgments and punishments. These plagues are, in the language of the Torah, just punishments. They are acts of divine retribution for the crimes committed by Mitzrayim. Our sages took this idea very seriously. For them, there was nothing random about each plague. Each one came in exact response to specific acts of cruelty by Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Each punishment satisfyingly fit the crime. Why did the Nile turn to blood? A midrash tells us the Egyptians closed the mikvaot so Israelite women could not purify themselves from nida. Therefore, the purifying Egyptian water source turned into blood. Alternatively, it's because the Egyptians spilled the blood of the baby Israelite boys by throwing them into the Nile. Therefore, the Nile was turned into blood. Why did God unleash the frogs? When Israelite baby boys were born, the women had to keep them from crying or making noise so they would not be caught and killed. Therefore, the Egyptians were tormented with the noise of the frogs. Why were the Egyptians struck with lice? Because they forced the Israelites to sweep the dust from their streets and shops. Therefore, all of the dust became lice. Why did the hail fall? Don't worry, I won't do all 10. Why did the hail fall? The Egyptians beat the Israelites, so the hail beat the Egyptians. You get the picture. God exacts justice, commanding nature itself to rise up and punish the Egyptians for their oppressive and murderous acts. Our sages call this meting out of just punishments midah keneged midah, measure for measure. The world of midah keneged midah is tidy, rational, and immensely satisfying. God intervenes to restore order, rewarding the virtuous, bringing destruction to the wicked. The extreme example of such a worldview is the Torah's account of Noah and the flood, in which God, with laser-like precision, saves the innocent few and wipes out those who engage in Hamas, lawlessness and violence. But as we all know, we don't live in a world of midah keneged midah, and neither did our sages. They, like us, lived in a world in which terrible things happened for no apparent reason. Good people got sick. The undeserving suffered, hatred and cruelty were pervasive. Evildoers were sometimes caught and punished, but very often were not. We can understand why our sages desperately sought to see order and justice in the world, because the alternative, random, purposeless suffering, is so disturbing. They believed ultimately that God's justice governs the universe, though the workings of that justice might not be apparent in the short run to us, or comprehensible to our limited understanding. For many of us, it's hard to find the faith that sustained our sages. When we look at all that's going on around us, we struggle to see any sign that the world is governed by a just and benevolent God. There are many ways that modern Jewish theologians have addressed this issue, but this Shabbat, as we approach Martin Luther King Jr. Day, I'd like to focus on how this issue surfaced in the life and thinking of Dr. King, just a bit. In 1955, speaking in Montgomery, Alabama, just before the launch of the bus boycott, Dr. King began his sermon like this: "Long ago, when proud Babylon ruled the world, the great Isaiah cried, 'Verily thou art a God that hidest thyself, O God of Israel, the Savior.' How often through the centuries has this cry risen to human lips? Of late, we ourselves have not been unfamiliar with it. We have seen imperialistic nations trampling over other nations with the iron feet of oppression. We have seen evil in the form of calamitous wars which left battlefields painted with blood, filled nations with orphans and widows, stacked up national debts higher than mountains of gold, and sent men home physically and psychologically handicapped. And God did not intervene. The awful silence of heaven remained unbroken. We appealed to God in desperate tones to intervene and defend his right. But still, evil continued to rise to astronomical proportions. Our generation feels afresh what Keats called the giant agony of the world. Small wonder that some, like H.G. Wells, complain bitterly, 'He is an ever-absent help in time of trouble.' And others cried out with the earnest believer Carlyle, 'God sits in heaven and does nothing.' It's clear from Dr. King's eloquent words that he understood very well the anguish of undeserved suffering. He understood and empathized with all those who could not see God working in the world. But for King, this was not a world in which God was absent. For him, as a man of faith, this is a world in which God is hidden. Our work then is to search out the hidden signs of God, to lift them up, amplify them, and bring them to life through our actions. Consider a second sermon that Dr. King delivered in the midst of the Montgomery bus boycott, when those who struggled for civil rights were being humiliated, threatened, and beaten on a daily basis. In a sermon called "Our God is Able," he told the following personal story. Almost immediately after the Montgomery bus boycott had been undertaken, we began to receive threatening phone calls and letters in our home. Sporadic in the beginning, they increased day after day. At first, I took them in stride, feeling they were the work of a few hotheads who would become discouraged after they discovered that we would not fight back. But as the weeks passed, I realized that many of the threats were in earnest. I felt myself faltering and growing in fear. At that moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I had never experienced him. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever." Almost at once, my fears passed from me. My uncertainty disappeared. I was ready to face everything. The outer situation remained the same, but God had given me inner calm. In this story, Dr. King encounters the enemies we all face: fear, doubt, a crushing sense of despair. Then, like Moshe, he hears a voice. But this voice does not come from a burning bush. It does not resonate like thunder or come from a mountain. It's a quiet voice within himself. It does not deliver a theology lecture or explain the notion of a hidden God. It says something very simple and clear. Stand up and do all that you can. Use your own voice, your own hands, to work for the good. Dr. King saw a powerful Christian message in the voice that came to him to bring a sense of inner calm, the strength that he needed to go on with his work. But his answer to the question, "Where is God?" strikes me as a very Jewish answer as well. And it reminds me of a story that my dad told me about his mother, my Savta. When she was a young woman, she experienced a crushing personal tragedy. Her beloved sister died of pneumonia at the age of 21. Out of the crucible of this loss, my Savta formulated her personal philosophy. Whenever my dad as a boy would say, "It's not fair," she would say, and my dad would say to me as well, "The world is not fair, but you can be fair." Again and again, she taught my dad that we should experience the world's injustice and suffering as a personal challenge, one that calls us to express our God-given drive for justice and fairness, for love and compassion. So where is God in these terrible times? I would say with my Savta and with Martin Luther King Jr., hidden and in plain sight. God is working through all the heroes who try to alleviate human suffering. God works through us when we can live out our highest values, when we listen to the inner voice of conscience and live up to the better angels of our nature. And on this Shabbat, when we celebrate the legacy of Dr. King, human, flawed, but heroic just the same, we should believe that our efforts make a difference. People can be fair, justice can be done, and God can be seen in the world. Shabbat Shalom.